As I say this morning, we're going to be turning our attention to John Huss, and as we'll see before we're done, the last year or so of the life of Huss, the name was actually pronounced more like Huss, and it happened to be the Bohemian name for goose, so that was his handle through life. When I was a little kid, people used to play with my name, Bruce the Goose. I always got that, among other ones, but didn't mind it too much. But anyway, that was his actual name, John Huss. And the last year or so of his life, he was in a dungeon. After having quite a luminary career and being widely respected in many quarters, he was reduced to the most horrific of circumstances, and that was just the months before he was then finally executed at the Council of Constance in 415, as we'll see. The reason I mention that to you right now is because as I was reflecting on his life, it reminded me a bit of the experience of the Apostle Paul, who, as you may know, at least there's one, I think, plausible theory that Paul was imprisoned in Romans twice. In the city of Rome, I should say, twice. Once when he was there under house arrest, and it was then that he wrote his so-called prison letters, Colossians, Philemon, Philippians. And then at least there's an ancient tradition that he was released at that point and recaptured, arrested sometime later under the persecution launched by Nero, and that was more on the order of 66 or 67. And then his arrest circumstances were not so pleasant. The first time he was under house arrest, a rented house, and it was, I wouldn't say comfortable, but certainly more comfortable than it could have been. Second time around, however, he was in a dungeon, something like the experience of John Huss. And it was then, presumably, that he wrote his final letter that we have in the New Testament, which is his second letter to Timothy. And toward the end of that letter, he writes these words. So this is 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning at verse 6, the Word of God. As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Then Paul has a few personal comments to Timothy, and dropping down to verse 16. At my first defense, no one came to support, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and save me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. It wouldn't surprise me a bit if John Huss, as he was in that dungeon, reflected on this text, which I'm sure he had memorized and identified to some deep significance with the experience of Paul himself. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Our Father, we're grateful for your mercies to us. We thank you for a history that you have written, and in some cases written it in the blood of your martyrs, your saints. And as Tertullian reminded us, it was the blood of those martyrs that in many cases was the seed of the church, a seed that grew and sprouted and bore fruit, and indeed we are an expression of that fruit. And so we give you thanks for characters like Wycliffe and Huss and so many others who paved the way for an opportunity for us to have your word and hear it and reflect on it, be encouraged by it. And we ask that our time of considering his life now would be blessed by your presence through your Spirit, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I mentioned to you last week, and I'm going to remind you by showing you the same slide that I showed you last week, that the 14th century is a century that I'm calling the shaking of papal authority. It had been pretty well shaken already we've been detailing to some degree the deteriorating prestige that was associated with the office of the Pope, and really the whole college of cardinals with him were more or less descending from one decade to the next into ever-increasing levels of what I think is properly called debauchery. And again, I'm using that term realizing it may be construed as being overly hostile to the Catholic Church, but I'm getting this language from Catholic historians. So I just want to make it clear that fair-minded Catholic historians have readily acknowledged that this was a dark, dark chapter in the history of the papacy. And they would remind us that though there was a Protestant Reformation, there was a Catholic Reformation, and that the Catholic Church today looks very different than it did at that time. So in fairness, I want to say that. If I sound like I'm being overly critical, I hope I'm being fair, and I hope I'm reflecting what I think is balanced Catholic historians as well. But anyway, this was getting near the nadir of the descent of the papal prestige, the 14th and 15th centuries. There had, of course, been, up until this time, as we were mentioning last week, a sense in which the papacy drew together. It was the centering power of European culture. In a time of fragmentation and decentralization, in many ways it was the Pope who was the centerpiece of that which seemed to call things into a kind of unity in spite of the fragmentation otherwise there. But there were these two events in the 14th century that shook things up. The first we looked at last week, the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, in which we find the Pope relocating to Avignon, outside of France, and casting his support unabashedly to the French in their ongoing conflict with England during the 100 Years' War, which was a territorial dispute between those two countries over pretty good-sized tracts of real estate in France. And the fact that the Pope just appeared to be nothing but a pawn used for PR purposes by the French king to bolster his side of that conflict was not only not well received in England, as you would imagine, but the rest of Europe as well was beginning to scratch their heads and wonder if this was exactly what the Pope was supposed to be about. And so that was the beginning. And then to make matters worse, right at the tail end of this Babylonian captivity, we have what's commonly called the Great Papal Schism. And so I want to pick up right where we left off last week with the story. We'll go back to Rome. You recall that the last of these Avignon popes was a guy by the name of Gregory the 11th. He had been in Avignon, but toward the end of his career went back to Rome. We discussed briefly his career at the end of our discussion last week. He was a vigorous persecutor of the Lollards. And you recall they were the ones who had been trained for the most part by John Wycliffe, had traveled out through England and the Holy Roman Empire and various other parts of Europe, proclaiming a message essentially inspired by Wycliffe's own understanding of things, and especially critical, of course, of the leadership in the church. Gregory had treated these people to horrific persecution, burning at the stake, forfeiture of property, and so on, as civil authorities carried out his decree. He also condemned Wycliffe's 14 articles and his greatest writing on civil dominion. We talked about that last week. All of that was part of his repertoire. He returned, however, to Rome from Avignon right before his death in 1377 and died then the following year in 1378. So that was his career, and the one thing we noticed was that he did come back to Rome. On his death, we have the election of a guy named Urban VI, who rules for about 10 years. The circumstances of his election were somewhat doubtful, as the cardinals were meeting there in the conclave in which they were evaluating and thinking and sort of contemplating the election of the next pope and so on. Right in the middle of their deliberations, a mob off the streets of Rome came bursting into their room, threatening in a very credible way violence against these cardinals if they didn't elect an Italian pope. They'd had it with these French popes. They'd had it with all of these popes who were in the back pocket of the French king. And so they came in, and the cardinals were terrified and promptly elected Urban VI, who was indeed Italian. And so under pressure of violence, they succumbed to that particular threat. And then the French cardinals immediately fled town, fearing that even though they had done what the mob had required, they might still be in some trouble. And so the French cardinals fled back to France and immediately elected a separate pope, you see, claiming that the pope that had been elected in Rome was not legitimate. And so now you've got, at this point, two popes, both of whom are claiming to be the true pope, and for the most part repudiating outright the legitimacy of the other one. So this becomes a little complicated. Believe me, I've been playing with these PowerPoints all week long, trying to make this less than totally confusing. And I'm not sure I succeeded, but we'll try to work through this in not too much detail, but enough that you sort of get a feel for what was actually going on. Well, this guy, Urban VI, interestingly, was kind of a firebrand himself, and appears to have been a person who himself had some deep concern about the moral decay of the leadership in the church among the cardinals and even of the papacy, and he immediately began preaching against the cardinals, the very ones that had elected him, but especially the French cardinals, talking about how they especially had sold themselves out to immoral lives that were just completely beneath the dignity of those who should be in these positions of leadership in the church. And so as he preached against them, he almost immediately alienated the King of France, who at this time was Charles V, and this is still in the middle of the 100 Years' War. And so the French king himself was very much in favor of this new pope that was going to be elected in France. But Urban also preached against the cardinals in Italy. He didn't feel like they were much better, and so he more or less isolated himself and precipitated a fair amount of violence there, even in Italy. And so his own position was somewhat embattled and, as I say, isolated, as even in the local situation, he was embroiled in various conflicts and so on. So his was not a very pretty situation. He was the pope, but he was fairly lonely and didn't have a lot of support during the years that he was ruling. All right, well, back at the ranch in France, we have the French cardinals now, who in the same year, 1378, elected Clement. And this is a little digital shot of him. And he, as his first official act, declared that Urban was the Antichrist. You know, what you lose in niceties, you gain in clarity. So he didn't want anyone to be unclear about his perspective. So he felt that Urban was the Antichrist and that he himself was the true pope. He reestablished then Avignon as what he called the official Holy See, the official center or capital of the Roman Catholic Church. All right, so we have Clement now, and then back in Rome with the death of Urban in 1389, a guy named Boniface takes the throne. These guys don't look nice. I don't know about you, but you know, and these are the most flattering pictures I could come up with. But here's Boniface, who is the Pope from 1389 to 1404. By this time, it's been about 10 years now that you've got two people both claiming to be the Pope, and Europe is pretty well divided on the subject. You can imagine the degree of cynicism that is sort of brewing beneath the surface now in the European psyche, as you've got two guys both repudiating the other and calling each other really awful names, you know, and claiming to be the true pope. And what you find is there's kind of a political division throughout Europe as to who's the true pope. The French and the allies of the French obviously supported Clement, who was the French pope, but the allies of England in this ongoing 100 Years' War tended to side with the Roman Pope, and so all of Europe, which was more or less aligning itself based on this ongoing conflict, found itself divided over the question of who was the true Pope. Each of these guys, of course, mutually excommunicated the other, but Boniface IX was inheriting now from Urban a very tumultuous situation in the Papal States. You recall that the Pope is essentially the king, the political ruler of the Papal States, and there's so much unhappiness even with the local Pope that a fair amount of rebellion is brewing, and so the Pope is dealing with a local rebellion against his own authority and trying at the same time to maintain that he is the Holy Father of the entire Christian world, and it became rather difficult for him to keep all of that together. He was under constant pressure to step down. He adamantly refused to do so, and so that's kind of what's going on at this point. This brings us now to Benedict XIII, who is the second and last of the Avignon popes. So we have two of these guys during this schism who are the French popes, first Clement and Benedict. And I'm going to hold off talking about him for just a moment. I know I'm trying to make this as confusing as possible, so am I succeeding? Is this working? Then we have Innocent VII, who inherits now years of tumultuous upheaval in the Papal States, and so things are becoming violent, and there's open rebellion really against his rule politically, not to mention religiously, there in Rome. He died only 2 years later under somewhat suspicious circumstances, and I think common wisdom is that he was poisoned. And that brings the last then of these popes. So Gregory the XII is the last of the Roman popes during the period of schism, while Benedict XIII is the last of the French popes during the Papal Schism. Gregory was willing to think about discussions of reconciliation, but didn't trust Benedict. Benedict said something of the same thing, and so you've got this very kind of guarded, tense discussion of a truce, but nothing much comes of it. And because things are more or less stalemated in this really difficult paralysis of leadership in the church, a council gathers. And this is called the Council of Pisa in the city of Pisa in Italy, which was convened in the year 1409. So in 1409, these people gather together and decide neither of the popes at the moment are the correct pope, and they elect a third one. And so now we have three popes. So the great Papal Schism becomes even more schismatic. And the guy that is elected at this point is Alexander V. Well, Gregory, ruling in Rome, repudiates him. He's not the Pope. And he repudiates the other one as well. And so the standoff continues. But Gregory himself finally resigned in 1415 at the Council of Constance. And the Council of Constance will be important to us in just a moment. All right, going back to Benedict XIII, he was a man of conspicuous, evident, notorious immorality, of a sort that I wouldn't really talk about in detail in polite company. But the point is that it was not secret, it was not in any sense something that was under the radar. People knew it. Anyone that was close to his administration was aware that this man was living a life of the most notorious kinds of immoral behavior, sexual and otherwise. And because of that, even though he was the French Pope, even the French were losing confidence in a hurry that this guy actually was a legitimate claimant to the position of Pope. He was finally facing so much violent threat against his well-being that he fled from Avignon in the year 1403. He was invited to come to the Council of Pisa in 1409, but refused, fearing the punishments that might befall him if he were to do so. And so he, while maintaining continually that he was the true Pope, nevertheless was more or less incommunicado at this point. Again, he refused to come to the Council of Constance in 1415. He died in 1423, having been condemned by the church and really rejected by the church, not only as Pope, but even as a priest, even as a Catholic, in 1417 at the Council of Constance. But to his dying day, he claimed to be the true Pope, and that continued until 1423. So that's what became of Benedict XIII. I mentioned the Council of Pisa in 409. Is your head hurting yet? Okay. I should have brought aspirin for this one, you know. The council elected Alexander V. He died only a year later, seemed to have been of natural causes, and this brought one of the most controversial characters to the papacy in this line now established by the Council of Pisa, whose name was John the 23rd. John the 23rd had never been a priest. He was a politician. He was a brilliant politician, and they thought, he's the guy who can pull this thing together, let's make him pope. But of course, usually you have to be a priest before you can be the pope. And so literally he was ordained a priest the day before he was ordained the pope. And that was the fellow who then carried out the papal duties based on the Council of Pisa from that point on for the next 5 years. There's two things that he did that were quite important for future history, so you might make a note of these. One of them was that he appointed the Medici family as the papal bank. Now, you know the name Medici. That's one of probably the most famous family name associated with Florence during the time of the Renaissance. In the late period of the Crusades, there were several families, especially in Italy, that had acquired a fair amount of wealth by becoming bankers and extending credit to those who were engaged in trade with the East, doors that had opened during the Crusades. Some of these families were rooted in places like Venice or Genoa, Milan, but one of the most important of them was, of course, in Florence. And the family that was especially important and visible there was the Medici family. Well, in a stroke of good fortune for the Medici, this particular pope, John the 23rd, made them the official bank. By this time, the papacy, in spite of its bad reputation, had acquired a fair amount of wealth, and so it needed a bank, and the bank was the Medici family. And so the Medici, on that basis, continued to be one of the most important centers of religious kind of activity throughout the next 100 years or so. And indeed, the pope that was ruling during the time of Martin Luther's career was Leo X, who was a Medici, you see, Giovanni Medici, and there were others as well. So this was really a doorway for the Medici family to themselves become eventually popes. So that was important. The other thing he did that was quite important and bears on the life of John Huss a little bit is he launched a crusade. I know you thought the Crusades were over, but in fact there were various crusades that took place sporadically in the later years. This was one of the most notorious. The Pope here, John the 23rd, got in a political conflict with the King of Naples, about 200 miles to the south there in Italy. And so rather than simply going to war, as any self-respecting, king would do, he launched a crusade, indicating that this is a holy war, and mustered, therefore, an army based on the fact that this was some kind of religious campaign that he was launching in this local conflict with the King of Naples. Well, the whole world just shook its head, rolling its eyes. What is this, And this is right at the point when John Huss is probably at the height of his power as an influence, preaching at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, Bohemia. And so he really uses this as part of the last, you might say, fuel for the message that he is giving concerning the present state of the papacy. So just keep your eye on that for a moment. He agreed, this is John the 23rd, to come to Constance and indeed relinquish voluntarily his papal authority there, as the Council of Constance would eventually reunite the papacy in one person, Martin, as we'll see in a moment. So the Council of Constance meets in 1413. The stated purpose of this council was to end this schism. 3 popes now, and it just is getting worse. And so the Council of Constance gathers. One of the first things it does is announce that the council has greater authority than any pope. This statement would have been extraordinary in the history of the Catholic Church, but it was never fully endorsed. And so it never has become the actual teaching of the church. The council set it as an expression of what was called the conciliar movement, which was a rising campaign in the Catholic Church to shift the center of authority from the Pope to a council, believing that councils would be more sane and responsible in their conduct of leadership than the popes had been. And this was an expression of that conciliar spirit. But as I say, it never quite became the force of law in the Catholic Church, but it was an interesting declaration to make. The Council of Constance deposed all three of these guys. All three of the popes, all claiming to be the pope, were relieved of their authority. In the midst of their proceedings, almost as a side issue, a kind of diversion virtually from what they viewed as the really important stuff going on, they had a very brief, rather two-dimensional trial of John Huss, who, as I said earlier, had been in a dungeon there in Constance for about 8 months. They unceremoniously condemned him. He was burned at the stake the next day, and they hardly noticed it. It was hardly even on the radar of importance for these people. They could hardly calculate the impact that this was going to have in later years, this kind of superficial dismissal of a guy who had become so widely respected as he had by that time. We'll look at his life a little bit more in a moment. Well, in 1417, the Council of Constance did indeed put back into the leadership of the church one pope, and this is Martin V, and he's elected the pope in 1417, and that's the end of the great papal schism. So I know this is more than you ever wanted to know on the subject, but there it is, and if you ever hear of it, that's what's going on. It's during this time, with this in the background, that the life of John Huss plays out. John Huss was born in what was called Bohemia. Bohemia was a province, part of the Holy Roman Empire. It'd be part of what would be today the Czech Republic, but at that time it was part of that empire. He was educated at the University of Prague. He was a brilliant student, distinguished himself very early for his mastery of languages and theology and humanities and so on, one of these kind of Renaissance characters before the Renaissance. He was so impressive that in 1402, when he was only in his mid-30s, he was made the rector of the university, and as part of his responsibility in that capacity, he was assigned the job of being the preacher in what was called the Bethlehem Chapel. That's what it looks like today. I don't know what it looked like at the time. I couldn't come up with an image of it, but it's still a very prominent and important place to this day. I don't know, anyone ever been to the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague? Some of the world travelers in here might have. I never have. But anyway, it's still a very impressive place, and so John Huss was the preacher. He was a powerful preacher. He was one of these guys who was just riveting. And so as folks would come and listen to him preach, there was profound impact that his message would have. However, his message was clearly, increasingly, as time went on, reflecting the writings of Wycliffe. Now remember, Wycliffe was condemned back in 1377, so we're about 30 years down the road, 40 years down the road here, and his writings have become widely disseminated. The attempt to silence Wycliffe, of course, had just the opposite effect. And so the writings of Wycliffe had been widely distributed, and there were many people reading them, and John Huss especially had been deeply impressed by the clarity and the insight and the courage that was reflected in the writings of Wycliffe. And so Huss, and he very much acknowledged it. This was never a secret, no form of plagiarism here. He was simply freely acknowledging his indebtedness to Wycliffe and certainly incorporated his writing and his critique of Catholic leadership into his own preaching based on what he read in Wycliffe. Well, in 1406, we mentioned earlier, Gregory the 12th became the Pope and immediately launched a warning against Huss. He knew what Huss was up to. He heard of him. Huss by this time was a quite famous man. Many people were aware of the influence that he was having, and so this new Pope, who was in Rome at this point, basically warned him, "You'd better back off or you're going to run into some real problems, Mr. Huss." And so John Huss declared on his own behalf, and many of the faculty at the University of Prague joined him in saying, "We're not so sure, man, that you're the real Pope, you know. So you can condemn all you want, but so far the jury's out on whether you have any authority to do any such thing." However, they also declared official neutrality across the board. They didn't know who the real pope was, and at this point they used that more or less as Exhibit A to prove that maybe the entire dysfunction of the leadership in the church should call into question that kind of loyalty that would otherwise be given to those. So anyway, this became a point where the university generally was neutral on the subject, and Huss took that view as well. The university, however, was beginning to split a little bit over Huss and his message. There were Catholic faithful in the university who, though they weren't sure who the true pope was, were sure that they should be giving pretty much unbridled allegiance to the church. And there were others who were kind of sensing in the air something different was going on. Certainly Wycliffe's message, and Huss was adding fuel to it, beginning to question whether or not this entire regime was really representative of true Christianity. Criticisms of things like transubstantiation and other core teachings of the Catholic Church were called into question, and for that reason you have a kind of division in the house there at the university. But Huss himself is never silenced, never gagged. He's permitted to preach freely, and he does so with increasing clarity and courage there at Bethlehem Chapel. In 1409, as I said, Alexander was elected the Pope, and he, in no uncertain terms, within a few months, condemned Huss. Simply said, the man is a heretic, and announced at this point that Huss should be essentially banned and tried for heresy. So Alexander takes that view. It may very well have been that there would have been some action along those lines, except for the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor at the time was a man named Sigismund. And Sigismund liked John Huss. It's interesting how sometimes these reformers are able to get some traction because they have political protection. Martin Luther, all of his career, was protected by Duke Frederick, Elector of Saxony, as you may recall. In a similar kind of way here, Huss is protected by Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor. But the Holy Roman Emperor, as much as he liked John Huss, was still a politician and is always kind of hedging his bets and not quite as stern or as strong a spine as we might have hoped. But anyway, for the time being, Huss is fairly safe, and he continues to preach, and indeed the fact that he's condemned as a heretic actually at this point gives him further fuel to preach even more courageously than he had. Well, John the 23rd, as I mentioned, in about the year 1412, declares a crusade against Naples, a holy war against Naples. And that does just knock everybody back on their heels. To invoke the name of the Crusades now for what amounted to a local squabble over a few kind of incidental differences between the two did seem pretty over the top. And that was what gave John Huss the fire, you might say, to really just launch a full-on frontal assault, a diatribe, if you will, against the papal authority in general, against Catholic teaching in general, and this whole kind of regime then came within the crosshairs of his powerful preaching, and many, many people were touched by it, and you might almost have thought that the Reformation might begin right here. He was indeed a pre-Reformation reformer, and in the providence of God, it certainly could have been the case that he would have turned out being the Martin Luther, but circumstances went otherwise. So Huss preached against that crusade. He preached powerfully, citing Wycliffe and others, even going clear back to the church fathers in support of the position that he was arguing for. He published in 1413 a work that was called De Ecclesia, which was clearly relying on Wycliffe, and he frankly acknowledged it. There was no plagiarizing. Really, it was just an updating of the work that Wycliffe had done. His on civil authority, simply restated here and more or less given some new updated application at this point in 1413. Well, the Council of Constance, as you know, met in 1413, and one of the things they did, one of the side issues they wanted to deal with, was this troublemaker John Huss, who's getting quite a following. He's publishing writings that are being distributed more and more widely, and there is concern that he's beginning to sabotage if it could have been so, already the rather deteriorating prestige of the leadership of the church and the church itself. And so, the Council of Constance commanded that John Huss come to Constance to stand trial for heresy charges, be given an opportunity to defend himself, and on that basis, his case would be disposed of. John Huss said, yeah, in your dreams. You know, he knew that if he went to Constance, the chances of him surviving were 0, and that this would be simply a suicide mission. And while he was courageous and willing to do whatever he thought God was calling him to do, he wasn't so sure that to just simply kind of willy-nilly run into the lion's den in this sense was quite the thing to do. So he declined, and there were no teeth at this point to enforce it, because Sigismund was still supporting John Huss and basically giving him protection. So John Huss kind of thumbed his nose at the Council of Constance and said that he wasn't going to do that. Well, the council continued to put pressure on, and the next year made an additional request that he come, and also proposed that Sigismund should give John Huss safe passage. Now, typically, in that time in history, safe passage meant you were safe. You know, here's the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, Constance is in the Holy Roman Empire. You see, he's not going to be leaving the territory ruled by Sigismund. He's going to be at Constance, which, by the way, is to the southwest of that region. It would be right at the northern border of Switzerland. And so it wasn't actually that far from home. Sigismund said he would supply to John Huss an armed guard, 4 or 5 soldiers who would travel with him, protect him from any kind of attacks along the way, and that he would be given this official signed safe passage from the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, John Huss believed that he could trust that because, for goodness sake, Sigismund had been fairly supportive down through the years of Huss and his ministry. And so, on that basis, John Huss was willing to go. He was happy to stand up and defend his teaching. He was willing to stand trial. He was willing to offer a biblical justification for the things that he was saying, and to offer to take his opportunity to speak his piece in that context. And so, indeed, he did, with this armed guard, go to Constance. When he arrived in Constance, the very guards who had been assigned to protect him immediately arrested him, and he was thrown into a dungeon. And he knew, of course, at that point he had been fully double-crossed by what he thought was his friend Sigismund. He was put into this dungeon. It was the most horrific of circumstances. It was filthy. It was infested with vermin. He was given the most, modest is too strong a word. He was just given virtually barely enough food to survive. He lost weight. He became very, very diseased in the circumstances he was in. It was awful by anybody's description. It was intended, of course, to break him. It broke him in his health. It certainly didn't break him in his spirit. But after he'd been in this dungeon circumstance for about 8 months, he was brought out in this awful condition, not given an opportunity to prepare himself at all, just without any notice whatsoever, just brought out of the dungeon and drug into this arena of pomp and circumstance, surrounded by all of these leaders of the church, who of course had much more important business on their plate than a guy like John Huss. They were trying to solve the big problems of the church that were obviously difficult for them at that point, and this was just almost a kind of a side issue. Huss was brought in. The record of the proceedings indicates that Huss, on more than one occasion, in spite of his broken health, tried to speak in his defense, sought an opportunity to articulate as best he could the position that he represented. He was immediately howled and jeered into silence, given no opportunity to say anything on his behalf except whether or not he would recant. He, of course, adamantly refused to recant, indicating that if he could be shown where he was in error, then he would be happy to rethink his positions. But he had felt he'd studied, done his homework, and believed he was in the right, very much the same way Martin Luther did at the Diet of Worms some 100 years later. And so on that basis, the council then summarily condemned John Huss to be burned at the stake, which took place about the next day. So he was taken out the next day, lashed up to the stake, and one of the most, I think, kind of filled with pathos, sort of amusing pathos here, was that Huss he often joked about his name. He was aware that having the name Goose was kind of a humorous thing, and he wasn't above letting himself be the punchline of a few jokes, and his last opportunity to do that came as his arms were tied behind him there at Constance, and he was about to be burned, and he made these rather interesting words. He said these words. He said, "Well, you can cook this goose, but after me, God is going to send an eagle that you will never silence." And they lit the fire, and his life was extinguished. Many people think, of course, that that's one of the most astonishingly prophetic statements anyone could make, because, interestingly, when Martin Luther, who was born about 60 years after the death of John Huss, began to teach the distinctive ideas that would be associated with his ministry very early, even before the Reformation, when he was labeled continually a Hussite. And that was the term that was applied. And before we ever heard of Lutherans, you see, there were the Hussites. Indeed, the execution of John Huss erupted throughout Europe in a violent display of hostility toward the church. This was viewed as one of the most horrific crimes that the church had ever committed, to take a man of such conspicuous integrity, of wonderful talent as a preacher, to abuse him this way and put him to death, just spread a kind of wildfire, you might say, through Europe that would eventually, of course, finally bear fruit in what we call the Reformation. So it was a remarkable moment, and as Tertullian mentions, the blood of the martyr often is the seed of the church. So that's the career of Huss, and as I was mentioning earlier, reflecting on his life makes me think of Paul, who was in similar circumstances. So just if you'll think with me for a moment about Paul's comments here. Paul says, "As for me, I'm already being poured out as a libation." You know that a libation in the sacrificial program of the Bible was an offering that was poured out of fluid like water or something like that. It would be poured out as a kind of offering. And these who are facing their immediate loss of life, of course, have this idea: my life is about to be poured out. And we, of course, can think about that and think about what's it like to be anticipating the prospect of your own martyrdom, as people like Paul and Huss and certainly many, many others through history and indeed even today are facing. And there is this idea, of course, that comes to our mind that there is a sacrifice. We think of sacrificing. You know, in the Old Testament, animals were sacrificed. Christ himself sacrificed. And we hear in the New Testament that we are called to offer ourselves, offer our bodies, a living sacrifice. And that this is a daily state of mind that we Christian people are to embrace. I suppose it drives the point home somewhat more dramatically. If I knew somehow or other that tomorrow I was going to be burned at the stake, I might have a more immediate sense of the sacrificial aspect of living a Christian life. Sometimes we worry about that. What would I do? You know, what would you do? What would I do? God has given grace, remarkable grace, to ordinary people like you and me down through history, and he's doing so to this day. So I think we can take comfort in that if something like that were to take place, God will give you the grace. But the point I think we need to bear in mind is that every day is a day of martyrdom, isn't it? Every day is a day when Jesus says, take up your cross. Take up the means of your own execution today. Follow me today. Let your life be poured out as a libation today. And if today happens to be the day of the ultimate sacrifice, so be it. If not, then it's still a day in which I am in a state of mind that would be appropriate to letting my life be poured out as a living sacrifice. John Huss, of course, had lived that way for a long time. He knew every sermon he preached was signing his own death warrant one of these days. But in fact, he was willing to stand by this great message that he believed was the truth of God, even if it meant putting his life at risk. And there is something of that that I think is very much at the heart of true and legitimate Christianity, is it not? And that every one of us can anticipate each day a day of being a libation poured out, as Huss, as Luther lived his life, as so many other Christian people have, so can we.